My colleague Loren Schulman and I are going to talk to you about defense innovation. So defense innovation is a very fashionable term right now in general, and for defense I would say it's dangerously fashionable. If you look at the Quadrennial Defense Review from last year, the word innovate or innovation was used 33 times. Unfortunately, it was often used as a synonym for miracle. In this environment, a word like innovate can become meaningless quite quickly. As you can tell from my wardrobe today, I'm innovating right now. All that's required is a basic lack of appreciation or respect for common dress standards.
So if all it takes to pursue innovation is good wardrobe, I think I'm probably doing okay. I will never catch up to Ben in terms of facial hair or accent, though, so clearly I've got a long way to go. All of this talk of innovation makes me think that many of us have seen this movie before, whether it be Defense Transformation or really before my time, Revolution in Military Affairs. Innovation is another iteration on a similar theme we've seen before. And I don't raise this to say that innovation is just another buzzword that we're going to see have its moment in the sun and then die out, but rather to say that organizational change management at the Pentagon is incredibly hard, let's face it. We've tried this before to some good effect, but it takes incredibly strong leadership. It takes a lot of dedicated folks inside the building who want that change to happen. And frankly, it takes really good branding. So if innovation is going to live up to this branding of being in the QDR dozens of times or being in every senior leader speech for the past 2 years, it's going to have to do more than just have this good branding and leadership support. It's got to change minds on the skeptics within the Pentagon itself.
That's right, and if we think about what's happening in the Pentagon right now, we can see that there's a significant amount of good work being undertaken using the rubric of innovation. We just saw the Deputy Secretary of Defense speak articulately and passionately and in meaningful ways about a number of things that fall under this rubric of innovation. In addition to that, we have a number of initiatives that predate the innovation agenda. Better buying power being a great example of that, which will help us have acquisition systems that can be innovative. In addition to that, we have standing organizations like DARPA or In-Q-Tel or the Strategic Capabilities Office, which are really at the forefront of making investments today on innovative systems and thinking about innovation. And then I think most notably, we have the Secretary of Defense who's come in with a clear vision and a short timeline focused on innovation, where he's pushing hard, establishing organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental in Silicon Valley, his Force of the Future initiative. This is clearly a man who is pushing hard on this topic of innovation for good and sensible reasons.
So from this laundry list that Ben just went through, I think we can all agree that there is a tremendous amount of energy and opportunity related to the innovation agenda these days. But a lot of us, probably folks in the room and some critics, have some fair questions and fair points about the agenda, starting with, are these huge range of initiatives, are any of them in conflict? Ben and I tend to think that, nope, they actually align pretty well, but the fact that there's confusion is an issue unto itself. Secondly, does the leadership team really have the bandwidth that it needs to fully manage this agenda and have it have the impact that they want it to have? Third, can someone from the outside, like someone on Silicon Valley, look at this list of initiatives and say, I know where to go for what, who's on first, or who's going to be able to remove resources for me or carry water for me? So far, from the feedback we're getting, not quite yet. And frankly, folks in the Pentagon and in industry are having the same questions. Lastly, one of the most prominent criticisms we see are, on top of the bureaucratic process that already exists in the Pentagon, the acquisition process, the procurement process, requirements, programming, personnel, can the innovation agenda really succeed when you're pairing it against these slow and cumbersome processes that we're all familiar with? So all that said, Ben and I actually think that Secretary Carter and Deputy Secretary Work have done a really great job creating space for the Pentagon to get out of its comfort zone and to innovate outside these processes and outside the traditional defense industry. However, we also think that their success is ultimately going to be judged on the amount of agility they're able to insert inside these core DoD processes and how much impact, or rather what's the longevity of these initiatives and the innovation agenda going to be after they leave. DIUX, I think most of us would agree, is a great step, but the Pentagon is bureaucracy friendly and risk averse even when it has leadership top cover and even when it has the flexible authorities and programs that have been built up. So question comes down to what needs to happen in the next year to make sure that this innovation agenda has staying power?
That's exactly right. Now, Loren touched briefly on the DIUX, the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. No conversation about innovation today would be complete without talking about the unrequited bromance between Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense. DoD really likes some Silicon Valley, but that love isn't quite coming back yet. We're going to get into some of that discussion in a minute. One of the things that we have been focused on at CNAS, Michèle, Loren, and I have all spent a fair amount of time in Silicon Valley over the past couple of years. Loren and I actually convened a working group out there a couple of months ago. Our friend Will Goodman, who's in the audience today, helped us set that up. There were a number of key things that came out of that conversation. One of the things that we asked the participants, who were all entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, many with DoD or national security backgrounds, we asked them to do a predictive exercise. Where did they think this kind of collaboration might go? The first thing that came out of this was sort of the pros and cons of high-level support for innovation and for collaboration with Silicon Valley. That's very good from the perspective of lending legitimacy to an organization like the DIUX, or allowing mid-level people in the organization to know that it's okay to work with Silicon Valley. The downside could be, in generating that momentum, we create unrealistic expectations that we just can't meet. The DIUX and Silicon Valley writ large can't hope to supply all of the demand for innovation that the Department of Defense has. When that doesn't happen, how's everyone going to feel about it? And that was best exemplified in the second thing that came out of the predictive exercise, which was the continued growth of a trend that's already occurring, which the participants referred to as technology tourism. For those of you who are not familiar with technology tourism, this is when senior officers or defense officials travel out to Silicon Valley to get briefed. They take a number of meetings, they receive briefs. They don't actually have any funding of their own. They don't have the ability to execute on a contract, and they're not actually going to be able to come back to maintain that relationship over time. So that means that they go out, raise expectations, dash those expectations, burn bridges, and then when people within the Pentagon or the services go out to Silicon Valley and seek to do business, they're met with closed doors. So we can see that some of these things are going to continue to occur over the next couple of years.
So the final thing that participants in this workshop were very focused on was what happens when tech tourism goes well? What happens when you have a challenging and maybe an urgent DoD problem that meets up with an out-of-the-box solution, whether from Silicon Valley or industry or elsewhere? Can the Pentagon actually follow up on a timetable that works for a startup? Or frankly, even these days, a timetable that works for defense industry or even for the Pentagon itself? As Ben has talked about, we have clearly general officers are lined up behind the innovation agenda. But our contracting officers, our program managers, are they willing to or able to take advantage of the flexible authorities and the new programs that Secretary Carter has initiated? Or are they really incentivized to actually avoid them in a lot of ways? Participants also asked, does DoD have good examples of prototyping or failing fast? Do they have models of what this behavior looks like? Or will they be much more inclined to go back to their traditional and slower ways of doing business when they have a chance? Can DoD take any of these successes that it may have and transition them and scale them to the larger enterprise? Or are they just going to impact a couple hundred folks or last for a couple years and then die on the vine? Bottom line, participants wanted to know, can the back office functions of DoD live up to the urgency you see in Secretary Carter's speeches? Ben and I tend to think that technically, yes, it can. It's got the leadership, it does have flexible authorities, it's got the resources, but culturally, this is still up in the air.
So with that sort of big question out there, this sort of forces us to think, what are we going to see over the coming 12 months of this administration and into the new administration? Loren and I feel that we have not yet hit peak innovation. You should expect to hear more discussion about this over the coming 12 months. And ultimately, as we think about it, our general feeling is, let's not get cynical too quickly. It's tempting, it's fun, there's a lot of great tweets we could all send. But while we know that this term innovation is going to become unfashionable at some point, we just need to accept that. As Loren said at the beginning, change is very hard in the Pentagon, and part of that means we need buzzwords and we need to get people behind this thing. We should not allow the good work that's being done under the rubric of innovation to be stymied based on our own frustration by a perceived lack of coherence, or just because we want to be cool and it's easy in think tank land to complain about terms like innovation. So let's not let cynicism be the enemy of good work. And just as Loren, and so we're about to bring on 3 other people to talk about that in more detail, but I want you all to take a moment to congratulate Loren Schulman on an excellent presentation. Thank you, Loren. So what we're going to do now is take a slightly deeper dive into this conversation. We're going to bring some more chairs up on stage. We have an excellent short panel with 3 experts. Michèle Flournoy, who I assume you're all somewhat familiar with, who has extensive leadership experience in the Pentagon, in industry, obviously in think tank land. We have Mr. Darryl Davis, who leads Boeing's Phantom Works organization, and Dr. Jamie Morin, who runs CAPE and can provide a detailed understanding of how we program things in the Pentagon.
Sorry, dude.
It's all on you, Jamie.
That's innovation right there, ladies and gentlemen, just the ability to adapt. So we're going to sit down and we're going to dig into a couple of these questions in a little more detail. So, Michèle, I'd like to start with you, and really thinking about this from a leadership perspective. I think that there is a clear impetus to innovate. My question for you is, how does one, from a leadership position, structure an agenda and sort of move the building, as we would say in Washington speak?
Well, I think the first step is to put a vision out there and create a sense of urgency. I mean, one of the real strengths in the Department of Defense, you have a very mission-oriented workforce. Yeah. And I think what you've been hearing Secretary Carter and Secretary Work doing is trying to make the case for why there's an urgent need to change the way we're doing business, why there is a need for innovation. You heard Secretary Work talk about a coming era of great power competition, that there are real challenges being posed by Russia, by China, that put our future military superiority into question. And so this is a very real issue. It touches our vital interests, and we need to do something about it. There is a window here, but that window won't stay open forever. So I think the first thing is vision. But beyond that, and I think they've done a good job of that, then you have to start creating the mechanisms that actually allow the innovation to occur. And here I think there's a work in progress. Right. Perhaps, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about this, but one of the things I don't see yet is a sort of real effort to realign incentives for the people who are doing this work so that they start to change behavior to get to a new set of objectives. Absent that change of incentives, the training, the support, you're going to have the sort of current culture, which is risk averse, which is wedded to these very slow, deliberate systems. You're going to have that culture prevail. So I hope we can talk a little bit more about how we might attack that.
I think that's important. If I could just ask a quick follow-up. So you're talking about incentives at the individual level, yes, essentially.
I mean, you have some very dedicated people who are mission-focused, who want to do the right thing, but they're operating in a system that basically disincentivizes the majority of the behaviors that are necessary to get real innovation. Yeah. So you've got to get at that inconsistency.
That makes a lot of sense. So Darryl, you run an organization that I actually appreciate. It doesn't say innovation sort of in the job description. I think Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz has a general investing philosophy that you should always short any organization that has an innovation department, which is not you guys, which is reassuring. But it is highly innovative nonetheless. So from your perspective as someone who leads an organization like this, how do you believe the DoD needs to change in order to allow you to innovate more effectively?
Thanks, Ben. That's a terrific question, because one of the things that we've tried to do in the Phantom Works is create the culture of an agile learning organization. It's back to risk, the willingness to take risk. and what happens if you do fail. In fact, I think it was Loren that said, fail fast. And in fact, I don't think you fail, you learn when you actually, some things don't work out the way you thought they would work out. And if you can continue to multiply those experiences of your people, then they are encouraged to take more risk and try more things. Now, granted, this is a business. We do have to return value to our shareholders and to the department. So it is important to risk the right things. But if you're not willing to take that risk, and that's part of what's happened in our business over the years, is it's become very slow, very methodical, very process constrained, and even to the extent that even as we go after some things, what we will find from an industry perspective is that the requirements are reduced to the lowest possible point where it really, innovation is not valued sometimes. In fact, breakthroughs are not valued because you reduce things to the lowest common denominator in the interest of having a fair and open competition. But if you're not willing to take the risk, that's why one of our main customers is DARPA, and we spend a lot of time with DARPA trying to understand how do we take risks to change the game, and how do we create a culture where our people can learn all the time and are constantly learning with agility.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Jamie, you've heard a number of us sort of prognosticating about defense innovation. It's very easy for us to do that outside the Pentagon. Just be interested in your thoughts on the current state of the innovation agenda within the building and sort of your read from your vantage point at CAPE.
Well, your dress code today actually is a good jumping off point for that, because in the Pentagon, we are capable of wearing casual clothes, but we require written instruction if we're going to do it. So my only regret is you didn't provide written instruction. It could have been much more comfortable.
Well, actually, no one told me that this was okay or not okay. This is just how I dress.
See, that's actual innovation. Right. Yeah, so, look, it's a great question. And I feel like we are starting down a path towards the buzzword of innovation, but it's a buzzword made up of a bunch of individual choices, a bunch of individual actions, a bunch of individual programs, and a shift in how people engage with their jobs and how they approach their problems that we set in front of them. That's the cultural shift that I think Secretary Carter and Deputy Secretary Work are trying to drive. It's not, innovation, 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 innovation. It's everybody coming at it with a different tone of voice, a different tempo, and applying it to different problem sets. And that's, I think, key. In my line of work, the programming and analytics, we've got to pull a bunch of bright ideas together. And the reputation that CAPE has as an organization among some folks in the defense community is we're the place you go to get no for an answer. It's because we were set up as an organization to be institutional skeptics, right? Secretary McNamara set up the organization to question the bright ideas, to drive change, but also to test ideas that represented change, because we've got the national security at stake here.
That's right.
Fast failure is something we have to do in the Department of Defense at a low level. At a small H's level. It's something we cannot afford to do at a grand institutional level, right? The country can't tolerate that. So we have to figure out, much like many large companies in the technology sphere and in manufacturing, in other words, they have to figure out how to innovate at an appropriate level, knowing that betting the company is probably not appropriate when you're a $500 billion a year plus enterprise like we are, with a nation relying on you.
That's right.
Yet if you can't make those bets at a small level, you will gradually, over time, lose your relevance and your efficacy.
I often think about this with the "it's okay to fail." I was giving testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee the other day, and I thought, imagine if I was representing a VC and describing how my financial portfolio had performed. Where basically I just frittered 80% of my funds away on bubblegum and CDs because I thought maybe they were coming back, but I got a 3x return on the 20%. I don't think that I would get a pat on the back from Senator McCain. I think there'd be a lot of questions asked about what happened to that 80%. But
Just mathematically, if you got a 3x on 20% and lost 80, you'd probably get fired.
Yeah, whatever. So that's why you're at CAPE. But you raised some important points, again, coming back to culture and personnel. And Michèle, I'd like to return to this. So from your experience, just from a leadership perspective and in sort of implementing things, to what extent do you think we should focus innovation efforts on personnel and organizational structures? Is that the way to go after this? Or how do we actually make it real for the people who can then move the organization forward?
I think, too often we rush towards redrawing the organizational chart because it's so much fun, and but when the real issue may be incentives, authorities, retraining, and rewarding people differently. And so when I think about what's at the core of innovation, you have to have a pretty healthy space and tolerance for competition of ideas. One of the challenges I saw in the Pentagon, overseeing, for example, working with CAPE, but on the policy side for force planning, for example, there is this drive towards consensus, and sometimes it feels like the tyranny of consensus, that getting everybody to agree is more important than the quality of the actual outcome you're producing. And so, but if you really want to deal with some of the challenges that Bob Work was describing, we need to create a safe space that allows services, COCOMs, industry, joint staff, OSD, come one, come all, let's compete ideas about how we're going to solve a particular channel, and then let that competition of ideas get tested out in further concept development, in wargaming, in experimentation, and so forth. And that's the stage where stuff can be tried and fail without too much real risk or cost. But to do that, you've got to have a different mindset. And I think some of that is, training people to operate differently and developing a cadre who really knows how to structure and run a competition like that. Some of it is incentivizing and rewarding people for taking those risks and producing, even if it's a failed something, if we learned a lot from it, that's a win, and hold it up as such. And then when you actually get to starting to prototype and looking towards what are you going to put in the program, the next challenge is the valley of death between a really great DARPA project or something that the Phantom Works is doing and into the program of record, because all the institutional antibodies come out and try to kill it before it takes dollars away from the legacy program. So, I mean, there are a whole series of challenges there, but I think if you lay out the sort of an end-to-end process and then really think hard about, have I trained the people and incentivized the behavior I want at each step of that chain, you may or may not have to do a big organizational change.
Right.
It may be more about just creating a different subculture. You can't change you will never change the dominant culture, but trying to create a healthy subculture that gets you across that chain of activity to actually some new and different ideas and programs.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I often think more of the Grand Canyon of death for the Pentagon rather than just a mere valley. That doesn't seem significant enough. But one of the things that we often talk about here, and a lot of my work focuses on the significance of commercial technology. So Darryl, from your perspective, you're in an interesting organization in that you're part of a business that has a significant commercial part and sort of an equally significant defense part. I'm just interested in your thoughts on, is that real? And if it is real, I think it's real, in what ways are you able to innovate based on having access to both of those markets?
Thanks, Ben. Terrific question, because living inside the Boeing company in our small organization with the learning culture that we have access to Big Brother called Boeing Commercial Aircraft, where innovation is happening all the time. It doesn't necessarily happen fast, but it is happening constantly, and where we can tap into that massive machine that's innovating in manufacturing, in composites, in autonomous manufacturing, and those kinds of things. It's powerful for where we can be the agent to take that to the department in certain places. But outside of that, there's a number of places where we touch Silicon Valley, we touch Cambridge Innovation Center, we touch universities, and in fact, one of the largest things that we have in the Boeing portfolio is our intellectual property portfolio. And there are tons of things that we as aerospace engineers or even commercial airplane or military airplane providers will never see a commercial application for some of those things. So we spend significant time understanding through venture capitalists, through entrepreneurs, and there's a big difference between an entrepreneur and an innovator, and how can you actually tap into that? And by the way, some of those big ideas that we've seen actually have a play back into the Department of Defense or into other places. So we spend a lot of time. It isn't a lot of money, but the exciting part for us is it challenges our young engineers and our young entrepreneurs to actually start thinking about the business differently. And in fact, you have to create that safe haven, which is really important for those people to think big and dream big, at the same time be willing to take bets. So we spend a lot of time, and in fact, the little company called In Situ that we acquired over a decade ago was a commercial UAS company that became a fee-for-service application in the war in Iraq that we actually acquired the company. But it wasn't because we were looking at UAS differently, it was we found a small company that actually had a very innovative product, and we found a way with them to take it to the marketplace. So innovation is not just about technology, it's business models, it's people, it's environments, it's safe havens, it's willing to take risk. But we're doing it constantly, and where we can leverage the power of our intellectual property across the department and out into the commercial environment, there are great opportunities still amongst us.
That's great. One of the challenges in hosting a conversation on a topic that I find this interesting with people of this quality is that we run out of time very quickly. So we're coming up on a hard stop here. I'm going to leave time for one question, so you all better come up with a one genius question. But Jamie, I just want to talk to you about, again, sort of a building perspective from two perspectives. One thing that we will often see is a lot of lofty language coming from the Pentagon, and for those of us who follow the Pentagon closely, we know really follow where the money goes. And the other thing that I'm interested in is the point that Loren raised earlier, which is how will the core of the Pentagon potentially be changed as part of this innovation agenda? So just be interested on thoughts from you about, is funding being reallocated associated with this? And is that for institutions that are part of the core of the Pentagon, or are we seeing things that are sort of being spun off outside of the Pentagon?
Yes. So that's a great question, and I think the key to understanding how to approach the problem that you're getting at there is thinking in terms of portfolio. So we have to start by thinking about innovation as a broad, overarching construct into which there's changes in stuff, and that's the most comfortable thing for many of us to talk about. So I'll come back to stuff. But there's also changes in people, the cultural question. I would argue you can change even core organizational cultures. It just takes decades, but you make a conscious effort there, and you can absolutely change subcultures that become the locus of future change. So there's the people piece, extraordinarily important in the Department of Defense. Then there is the concepts for utilizing the tools you have, whether they are human individuals, the tools of our national security, whether they are hardware tools, whether they are from a wide range. That's key. And then you have to think about the stuff. But the stuff portfolio is, a huge piece of our Department of Defense expenditure. It's something that the Congress and the taxpayer have a right to think that right to know that we're thinking about very rigorously. And there, the critical piece is thinking about the portfolio as a portfolio.
Yes.
And if you have a financial manager, either for a company or an individual, you are looking to have a portfolio that has a variety of risks, a variety of instruments that protects you against massive swings of one sort or another. And you have to leverage things in different ways. So as we look towards technological opportunity, I'm really looking at 3 or 4 different ways of getting after it. I'm looking at how can we take existing capital investments we have, that are already in the inventory, or that are coming into the inventory, and use them differently or augment them in some way to make them more effective. That can be enormously important innovation. I'm looking at how can I modify the next generation of something like that in a way that breaks out of a cost-acceptant paradigm or drives us to do something in a fundamentally different way that is really effective. And then I'm looking at radical innovation that completely takes us out of our existing understanding and domain. We want a mix of all of those, because we've got to be ready for short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And we know, as you go across that sort of spectrum of riskiness and degree of change, and across that spectrum of time, that each of those has a successively lower probability of coming true in exactly the way you laid it out.
Right.
We've got to be capable of failing at those incremental levels, at those individual eaches levels.
Yep.
And we have to accept that as you're looking 30 years out, as you're talking about the kind of things Deputy Secretary Work talked about this morning, human-machine teaming and autonomy and the like, some of that is more speculative, more risky, but we've got to get after it in a way that leaves us open to success in a wide range of potential futures. Portfolio thinking is key to that. That's why we've been doing a series of strategic portfolio reviews across the department, looking at areas like power projection challenges, looking at areas like deterrence, looking at areas like space, and looking at them in a very deliberate portfolio context to make the smartest choices we possibly can.
That's fantastic. Okay, so we have time for one question. So no pressure, but someone better come up with a really impressive and insightful question. We have a gentleman here pointing his thumb to himself. I admire your strength of conviction, so please ask your question.
Fence, good morning. For the last 25 years, acquisition has gotten slower. We have built less with more money. We all know the basics. You have other transaction authorities. You have lots of ways you can do these things. Why don't we, and as we pursue the third offset, do something radical where we create effectively a third offset DARPA, where they are given a pot of money. Yes, we can talk to Congress about oversight, and let them do it. I mean, there are so many authorities already existing. It's a command organization. Can't we stand up and create a safe space for them that way?
So, yeah, everyone's looking at you, Jamie. So I think that's
the crux of your question is, can't we have somebody and have them do it? And the challenge there is, what is it? To tell somebody to go out and do it, you've got to define it. And so it is something, warfare, which is fought at the eaches. It's fought by men and women in uniform operating in complex environments. And a point solution, a command solution to those problems that is set loose and runs and produces something 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months later, it's a part of the answer, but it can't be the whole of the answer. It can't be the whole of the answer because you're talking about tools, hardware, that operates in the context of complex human endeavor. And so I think we absolutely need to use some of our specific acquisition tools and techniques to get at things faster. There was mention earlier, I think, Loren, to the Strategic Capabilities Office. They've done great work in figuring out particularly how to make existing stuff do novel things. And there's huge room for innovation there that is, I think, delivering really substantial improvement. But I'm not going to go out and ask somebody to design the successor to the Joint Strike Fighter alone in a small think tank and have them produce it and then sell it to us as a commercial item. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work because we can't have enduring competition year after year for those kinds of things, and the scale is too large. So it's an important piece of the puzzle, an important piece of the portfolio, but it's not the whole answer.
So, Colin, that was such an impressive question that the time gods have given us a little bit of extra time. I'm going to take the first prerogative and ask Michèle one question while you gather your thoughts and ask similarly impressive questions. So, Michèle, I just wanted to come back to this sort of Silicon Valley conversation. You spent a lot of time out there with some very interesting people. I'm just interested in your thoughts on sort of what potential is really there and what's the quid pro quo. I think it's fairly clear to those of us in Washington what we get out of it. What, from your perspective, can we provide to Silicon Valley, to that community, that makes it worth their while in terms of collaborating with us?
I do think that the potential for collaboration is there. I think there are a couple of key challenges. One is there is a trust deficit post-Snowden. even though, that is something that we won't spend a lot of time on here. But suffice to say, we have to climb back from that, and I think there's some trust building that has to go on between a number of parts of the U.S. government and parts of the Valley. Second is there has to be a business case, particularly for every company, but particularly for some of the more innovative, earlier in their development companies. There has to be a business case to work with the U.S. government. And a lot of times, their VCs take a look at this and say, are you crazy? This makes no sense whatsoever. Stay away from the government if you possibly can. So we've got to deal with their concerns about intellectual property. We've got to create paths where the obstacles to much more rapid and responsive procurement, sort of being able to procure multiple generations of something over time. This is particularly acute in the IT area and the applications area. We just have to move at a different cycle rate to make the business case real for them. And then it gets back to people again. We have to have trained people in DoD who know how to work with this part of the economy, which is different, does operate on different times and rules and so forth. But we also have to have some people out there who can really be liaisons and help them understand how to work with this sort of fear-inspiring, gigantic, beast of the U.S. government. So, I think it can be done, and I think there are people who, frankly, out of patriotism and determination, are bridging the gap and making it work. You can find lots of small examples. But we need to figure out how to do this at scale. And, oh, by the way, innovation is not owned by Silicon Valley. We need to also be going to major defense industry, to other parts of the country, whether it's the I-128 corridor up in Boston or what have you, to find multiple paths to really leverage what's going on out there.
I think that's exactly right. I can't see any hands up, so I'm going to take this opportunity to ask Darryl your thoughts on the same thing. You have access, you have hooks out there. One of the things that really has struck me in conversations with you and some of your colleagues is the advantages that large organizations have here. It's very hard for a startup to get involved in building composite materials or undertaking manufacturing at scale. Just be interested in your thoughts on what advantages are there for your organization in collaborating with Silicon Valley and what the benefits are for them.
So terrific, Ben, thanks. A lot of interesting things happen when we have the opportunity to engage with Silicon Valley. And by the way, it isn't limited to Silicon Valley because it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it is on a global scale. And in fact, through some of our entities in Boeing Defense that are overseas, we have great research and development centers in Madrid, in Australia, and in India, and other parts of the world. The challenge for us is to find the two ideas that click in an innovation or an entrepreneurial environment where the sum of 1 + 1 = 11 and not 2 or 3. And that really comes down to people, and it is that geometric effect when a big idea is augmented by someone else with some other big ideas. And it's back to that collaborative environment that you mentioned, Michèle. When we see those things happen, the question for us as leaders then becomes, instead of saying, why would you do that? Why not would you do that? In fact, in enabling people to take that risk and see, it's not the fail fast, it's take a step and see if it can mean something. And then if it can mean something, then go farther. And that's where it becomes important, where through some of the modeling and sim or experiment capabilities where you can actually test things, whether it's in a simulated environment. And then can you do it in a way that you can mature it, because you are protecting the enterprise. You have to protect the enterprise. And when you can harness commercial leverage that way, it can geometrically scale rapidly. And that's part of the long process that we face some days in the Department of Defense, when we can find ways to work not around it, but with it. Colin, to your question on the OTAs, when you can partner with the department, you can do things differently. So it's innovation and business models with the department. And by the way, Congress has a very big say in how do you do that as well.
That's right. Okay, there is a sign being flashed at me that says last question. I'm going to follow that sign. There is a hand up in the back. On this hand side, on this side. There's a microphone coming to you, sir.
James Drew from Flight Global. Particularly to Boeing Phantom Works, as you look at sixth-gen fighters and all these other good things that are lingering out there in the future. What are some of the big technology, or what's the main technology that you're going to pull out of your hat and offer to the world?
I'm sure that all of the SAP programs that you guys are working on, we'll talk about that right now.
I have nothing to offer on that. Actually, I think the Deputy Secretary said it best this morning in his 5 tenets of the third offset strategy. You know, autonomy, deep machine learning. I mean, today I would tell you from where we sit, 6th-gen air dominance or whatever you prefer to call it today, and we're waiting for the department to decide, it's not about a pointy-ended airplane just yet. It is about a system of systems, and how will, from the minute you indicate or see a threat, how do you actually counter that threat with multiple tools in your kit bag, from cyber all the way to electronic warfare. So there's a lot of innovative thinking going on. The challenge for us in industry will be working with the department to understand how best to take on some of those challenges with the competitive environment, be it Russia, be it China. So how will we do that, and how will we do it as a nation with our allies?
If I can add just
Please.
one point on that as we wrap, it's that the department is really trying to think rigorously about reducing risk as we look toward that transition. There's a lot of unknowns as we look toward that future transition. Again, you heard the deputy talk about some of the key ones, but we are looking at identifying where are the bureaucratic, cultural, technological risks along that path, and how can we make focused, modest investments or focused, modest changes to how we do business that will better enable that transition, knowing that that's going to be a matter of decades.
That's excellent. Well, thank you to this excellent panel for talking in practical terms about a somewhat inchoate topic. So if we could all just thank these guys for their time. This was a fantastic session. Thank you.